Michael Dasher comes from a long line of oystermen, and his son, nicknamed Little Mike, is now following in his footsteps, gathering oysters in Florida's Apalachicola Bay, a way of life that oystermen say is dying. Last year, they hauled in 16,000 pounds of oysters worth $130,000, according to state figures, a fraction of the 3 million pounds caught in 2012, worth nearly $9 million. That has left the 53-year-old worried that his son may be the last of 5 generations of Dashers who made their living on the bay. Now their future may hinge on a decision by the Supreme Court, which is expected to rule later this year on a 7-year-long legal battle between Florida and Georgia.
Our last day probably for 2 weeks. They letting all that water come down. The bay closes at sunset today.
Florida accuses Georgia of drawing too much water from the rivers that feed the bay, causing its salinity to rise and driving down the oyster population. Georgia rejects that claim, saying that what has really hurt the oyster population is a surge of overharvesting. The current state of play involves a swelling Atlanta, as well as Georgia's peanut and cotton farms, all drawing from the same freshwater sources that flow to the Apalachicola Bay. There, residents like Lynn Martina, who have long relied on the water to support their sources of income, have had to adapt.
When I couldn't get enough to load my trucks, I knew I had to make a decision what I was going to do. We went from selling them by the tractor trailer load to by the dozen. So that tells you what kind of decline, the seafood industry is in, or the oyster business.
But those in Apalachicola Bay have a reason to be worried. The U.S. Circuit Judge, a state water rights expert who was named a special master in the case, has recommended that the court side with Georgia. But the court can ignore his recommendation if it's swayed by Florida's arguments. Something the Dashers and the dozen or so oystermen left working the Apalachicola Bay are hoping for.